In the previous module, we talked about the descriptive studies where we learned about how to describe the disease in terms of the time, place, person. In this video module, let us move ahead and talk about the analytical studies. If you talk about the analytical study designs, they are different from the descriptive study designs. But what did you learn in descriptive studies? There could be case studies or there could be case series, right? You remember that's what you had done. Now in analytical study designs, there are many study designs. Please note that whatever studies I'm going to teach you, I'm going to tell you, there is no order in that. It's not that one should be followed by two or two should be followed by three. You could do one and then three or three and then one, whatever we want. So the first study that you would like to do is, let us say that you go to an area. In the area, you do a complete survey of the area. You do a complete survey of the area. In the area, you find out that this many people actually have disease. So this many people actually have disease. You see what is their nutrition level. You see what is their education level. You see what is their occupational level or occupational health, and you see their age and gender, and you compare it with the healthy population. What type of study is this? Please note, this is your first study design. This is called as a cross-sectional study. This is called as a cross-sectional study design. MCQs on cross-section study. In a cross-section study, first MCQ, you're going to start with what? We are going to start with the total population. In a cross-section study, you are going to do a survey. Please note that these are, whatever I'm going to say, whatever I'm already saying, these are the pure keywords. You find them in the MCQ, you mark your answer. So if the question says general total population was taken, answer is a cross-section study. If the question says that a survey was conducted, answer is a cross-section study. Next in line, in a cross-section study, you're going to find out what? You're going to find out the incidence or the prevalence, both or none. What are you going to say? Please note, in a cross-section study, you're going to go to the area. In the area, you're going to find out how many people have disease. So what is this? This is what? Incidence or the prevalence? This is called as the prevalence. Prevalence. The cross-section study is also known as a snapshot of the population. Why? Because you are taking actually a photo of the population, that these many people have disease, these many people do not have disease, and things like these. So moving ahead, let us say we plan another type of study, study number 2. In the previous study, let us say that this was the area, you had done a complete survey and you had found out that these many people are diseased, right? This is what? This is a cross-section study. You are going to find what? We are going to find the prevalence. Alongside, in a cross-section study, you should also appreciate this fact that we studied the age, the nutrition, the education, the occupation, and many other factors. You are basically generating that probably this could be the risk factor. For example, I want to say that, let us say people who were diseased, out of these people who are total disease, you found out in the area, the people who are diseased, you say that maybe people who had a specific occupation, they were more. So you try to hypothesize that probably this could be one of the common factors in these. So based on this, if I plan another study, that out of these diseased area, let us say I take 50 people with disease. I take 50 people with disease out of that area, the disease population, I take 50 people, and I take 50 people who are my healthy population. 50 people who are healthy, and I ask them that, do you have that risk factor, yes or no? Yes risk factor or no risk factor? Please note, we are asking for the risk factor. That means you should appreciate this point. That means in the previous study, you actually had maybe hypothesized that probably this could be the risk factor. So in a cross-section study, you are hypothesizing that this could be the risk factor. You try to find out some things, or maybe 5 things that could be the risk factors. So now you do this type of study. What is this type of study called as? Where you take some cases and you take controls. What is this type of study? This type of study is called as a case control study. This is called as a case control study. MCQs on case control study. Beta, please note, you start your study with what? Focus on the word start. You start your study with what? You start your study with the total population, or with the people with disease, or with the people with risk factors. What do you start your study? We start our study with people with, start with disease or non-disease. It is different from the cross-section study where you start your study with total population. In a case control study, you will find out what? You will find out the risk factor, you will find out the disease, or what are you going to find out? Please note that we are going to assess for the risk factor, right? Common sense, you're going to assess for the risk factor. So if you're going to assess for the risk factor, you already know that there is a risk factor which causes a disease, right? In a case control study, you already told me that we start with the disease. So you are going to assess what? You are going to assess the risk factor. So common sense, you go ahead in time or you go back in time. Common sense, we are going back in time. This is also called as a retrospective study. If this is called as a retrospective study, it goes from it goes from the disease to the risk factor. Disease is what? This is the outcome or the effect. And what is risk factor? This is the cause. So it is from effect to cause or cause to effect? It is from effect to cause. Next MCQ. In a case control study, you're going to find out what, beta? You're going to find out the incidence or the prevalence, both or none. Please note, in a case control study, there is no incidence. There is no incidence and there is no prevalence. If I give you 50 diabetic and 50 non-diabetic, can you tell me that how many total diabetics are there in my area? No, you cannot tell me the prevalence, right? If I give you 50 diabetic and 50 non-diabetic, can you tell me how many new diabetics came in the area? Of course, you cannot tell. Please note, there is no incidence and no prevalence from a case control study. These are retrospective study. They look back and they are effect to cause. In a case control study, like in cross-section study, you had conducted a survey. In a case control study, what are you going to conduct? Like, are you going to do follow-ups? Are you going to do survey? Or are you going to do question-based or interview-based techniques? Please note, we have to ask, do you have the risk factor, yes or no? So case control study is an interview-based study. Case control studies are interview-based studies. Please note that no study will give you prevalence except cross-section study. Please note, all studies are prospective or they could be anything except case control, which is the only one which is a retrospective study. Please note, interview-based study is a case control study. No incidence is found and no prevalence is found, right? There could be another type of study that we could do. Let us say this was my area. You had conducted a survey and you found out this many people with the disease. And then you found out some risk factor, occupational health, they were all doing pig farming or something. Now let us say I plan another type of study. Let us say I take 50 people with the risk factors and I take 50 people without no risk factor. Like let us say in this my cross-section study, let us say in the cross-section study you found out that there was a specific occupation which people were doing pig farming. So let us say you start people with a risk factor, that is they were doing pig farming. And 50 non-risk factor, they were office going or they were mechanics or anything. They were not pig farming. So now let us say I follow them. What will I do? I follow them up. If I do follow up and then I find out that how many people got yes disease, no disease, how many people got yes disease, no disease, what type of study is this? Beta, this is a typical example of a cohort study. This is a typical example of a cohort study. MCQs on cohort study now. MCQs on cohort study. What do you mean by cohort? Cohort is a group of individuals with common characteristic. Group of individuals with common characteristic is called as a cohort. MCQs on cohort, selected MCQs, very frequently asked questions. In a cohort study, you start your study with what? You tell me. You start your study with the total population, or do you start your study with the total disease and non-disease, or do you start your study with the total risk factors and no risk factors, or people with exposed or no non-exposed? Please note that in a cohort study, you're going to start your study with, focus on the word start. Focus on the word start. You start your study with what? You start your study with people with risk factors and no risk factor. You start your study with the risk factor and no risk factor. What are you going to do? You already know that there is a risk factor and the risk factor causes disease. So in a cohort study, you start your study with the people with the risk factors. So obviously you do a follow-up. So you go ahead in time, right? You're doing a follow-up. So you go ahead in time. If you're going ahead in time, you start your study with the risk factor. So it is called as a retro or a pros. Common sense, it is called as a prospective study. It is called as a prospective study. In a cohort study, what is the mode? Like, how do you do a cohort study? Will you do a survey? Will you do knock-knock interviews? Or will you do follow-ups? We do follow-ups. In a cohort study, what are you going to find out? The incidence or the prevalence? Both or none? What do you think? You remember, I told you sometime back in the previous modules that this is the world. In the world, there are always jug with the disease. So there are some of the new cases, and then there are the padeo cases or the prevalent cases. Then there could be cure, there could be death. We remember we talked about this. Let us say that I want to plan a cohort study. I take 200 people, out of them 100 are with the risk factors and 100 are without the risk factors. I do follow up. If I do follow up, after some days, I find out 100 how many are normal and how many develop disease. Out of this, another 100 how many are normal and how many develop disease. So I can find out how many got disease. Are you getting it? Will that total tell me that is what incident cases or the prevalent? That is the incidence cases. That is the incidence cases. Will that incidence tell me the total people who are there in that jug? Answer is no. So cohort studies will tell you what? Incidence or prevalence, both or none. Answer is only incidence. Please mind it. Please remember, no study is going to give you incidence except cohort study. No study is going to give you prevalence except cross-section study. So that's very important for you to know, and please note it is different from a cross-section study and a case control study. Another point over here is that you already told me that there is a risk factor which causes a disease. So you go in a cohort study, you go from effect to cause or cause to effect. Common sense, I think we go from the cause towards the effect in a cohort study. That is the direction. So in a cohort study, please note that you go from cause to effect. Beta, whatever we have written over here in the cross-section studies, in the case control studies, and in the cohort studies, these are your pure keywords. You find them, you mark them in your MCQ. Now let us play a small game. Let us say that I conduct a screening camp for diagnosing diabetes mellitus, or I conduct a screening camp, diabetic screening camp for glucometer testing and checking the weight of the people and so on. So let us say in my screening camp today, this is table A, 400 people come in the screening camp. Out of them, while doing the glucometer testing, I found out that how many were diabetic and how many were non-diabetic. Let us assume that out of these 400, 100 came out to be diabetic. So obviously, how many are non-diabetic? Common sense, 300 will be non-diabetic. Let us say that I was very academically inclined. I wanted to find out how many people were obese out of those diabetics or non-diabetics and how many were non-obese, right? So there is a risk factor I'm testing and there is a condition that I'm testing. So let us say out of 100 people, I found out that roughly approximately 70 were obese. So how many are non-obese? Common sense, 30 will be non-obese. Out of the 300 who were healthy individuals, we still found out that 130 were obese. So how many are non-obese? Common sense, 170 are non-obese. So total is 300, right? So what type of study design is this? This study design number A. Okay, so keep in your mind what do you want to answer. Let us take another study design over here, B. Let us say that I go to a clinic. In that clinic, I pick up some people with diabetes. So I go to a medical OPD, I pick up 100 people with diabetes, and then I went to the skin OPD or the psychiatry OPD. In the psychiatry OPD, considering that people are non-diabetic over there. Considering that the people are non-diabetic over there. So if they are non-diabetic patients, I pick up maybe 300 people who are non-diabetic. Out of them, if I see that how many have obesity or non-obesity, so out of 100, I find out that 70 have obesity and 30 do not have obesity. Out of the healthy population, 300, I found out only 130 have obesity and remaining 170 are non-obese. So what type of study is this? This is your study number B. what do you think is study A and what is study B? Let us say another type of study. Let us say that I go to an area, I go to any area where people are having a lot of food, right? Let us say I go to a food junction, food court. So people who were having large 24-inch big pizza. So people who were having that large 24-inch big pizza, I pick up 200 people who were having large pizza alone. And I also pick up 200 people who were doing gym over there. So total, how many I have? 200 who were obese and 200 who were non-obese. Let us say I follow them for a period of 1 year. I find out how many people will get diabetes after 1 or 2 years and how many people will have no diabetes. So out of these 200, I found out that majority, like 70 got diabetes. Out of these non-obese 200, only 30 got diabetes. So common sense, the remaining were non-diabetic, that is 170 and that is 130. What type is my study number C? I think many of you must have already answered by now that what is this study number C, beta? You start with, mark the words, understand the words that I am saying. You start your study with what? You start your study with the people with the risk factors and no risk factors. With the risk factors and no risk factors. Are you getting it? This is what is a cohort study. See, the numbers were not mattering at the time. Numbers are same on all the three conditions in study A, B, and C. What matters is you start your study with what? What is the study number A? Study number A is I started my study with the total population. And can you believe, listen to the words, out of my total population, I found my people with diabetes. Finding my people with diabetes is what? Incidence or the prevalence? It is the prevalence. In this study B, I took 400 again, but did I find this 100? Can I say that 100 is a prevalence? Can I say that 1 in 4 patients are diabetic? Answer is no, you cannot say in study B. So what is the study B? Beta, you start your study in the study B. You start your study with, listen carefully, you start your study with disease and you start your study with non-disease or whatever is not there. Whereas in the study A, you start your study with the total population. So what is the answer? What is study A? It is a cross-sectional study. Did you get this point? It is a cross-section study. And what is study number B? It is a case control study. What is study number B? Say with me, it is a case control study. Please note, the way you start your study, that is going to define what type of different study is it. If you're starting your study with the total population, that is what is called as a cross-section study. If you start your study with the disease and the non-disease, that is called as case control study. If you start your study with the risk factors and no risk factor, that is called as a cohort study. So now let us just play around with these numbers. I hope you understand. I've just squeezed in these boxes. It's the same numbers we are talking. This is what is a cross-sectional study. This study number B is what is a case control study, and study number C is what is a cohort study, right? I hope we understand this. Now let us play around with these numbers. If I just name these cells in a case control study, let us say I name the cell as A, this is B, this is C, and this is D. I'm just naming. So what can you tell me that which cells make sense to you, which are the logical cells? Please note that beta, people who were diseased, right? This group. So I'll just delete it. People who were diseased in this group. People were diseased, and do you think the exposure or the risk factor should be there or not there? It should be there. So people diseased should be having the risk factor. That is, A cell will make the logic to you. On the other hand, if you talk about the people who were non-disease, and then which cells make more logic to you? The people with risk factor or no risk factor? People without risk factor. So that means which cells make sense to us? The logical cells are A and D. On the lower side, which are the non-logical cells? The non-logical cells are common sense. Non-logical cells are B and C. Are we getting it? So this and this, B and C, are the non-logical cells. So now if I just take the ratio of these, that is A into D over B into C. What does it mean? It means that this is the box that we were dealing. I do A into D divided by B into C. That is A into D over B into C. What is this called as? This is called as odds ratio. Please note, this is called as odds ratio. It is the ratio of the odds. It is the ratio of the odds that is called as odds ratio. A few questions on what do you mean by odds ratio. odds ratio. What do you mean by odds ratio? Please note it is a cross product ratio. It is calculated only in a case control study. And what is the formula? It is the logical cells divided by the non-logical cells, that is A into D over B into C. You need to memorize this by heart 3 by 5-star MCQ topic, that is odds ratio. So what do you mean by odds ratio? That is a cross product ratio. So in a cohort study, what are you going to find out? We are going to find out what? You remember we already did that in a cohort study. You are going to find the incidence. So if I say about the cohort study, can you think and tell me what is the incidence? Mark the words. What is the incidence of the disease in the exposed group? Beta, which one is the exposed group? The exposed group, don't you think is the one which is on the above side, that the people who were obese? So what do you think is the incidence or the risk of disease in the exposed group? Which one is the exposed group? The top group, that is A and B or A and C? That is A and C. Out of them, how many people had disease? That is the number A. So that is incidence in the exposed group. Can I write it as A over A plus B? A over A plus C, not B. A over A plus C. Can I say that what is the incidence in the non-exposed group? The non-exposed group, the incidence is given by, in the non-exposed. Which one is the non-exposed? The non-exposed is the lower one. The non-exposed group, what is the incidence of disease? Can I say that it is B over B plus D? If I divide the incidences, if I divide the incidence of the disease in the exposed group divided by incidence of the disease in the non-exposed group, this funda is called as the ratio of the risk, called as the risk ratio. A few words on risk ratio. This is also called as the relative risk. Let us have a few MCQs on relative risk. Relative risk. Relative risk is also known as risk ratio. It is given by the formula incidence in exposed divided by incidence in non-exposed. It is calculated only in cohort studies. It is calculated only in cohort studies. Please note, in the cohort studies, we may find out something else. In the cohort studies, you also may find out something else. We can also find out something called as attributable risk. Attributable risk. What is the formula for attributable risk? The formula for attributable risk is given by the formula incidence in the exposed group minus incidence in the non-exposed divided by the incidence in exposed group. This is known as attributable risk. What do you mean by attributable risk? We are just very shortly going to come back to this. Next, in this cohort study, do you also know that we can also calculate something else? So what did I tell you till now? We calculate the relative risk and we have calculated the attributable risk. Apart from this, in the cohort study, we can also calculate something called as the population attributable risk. What do you mean by the population attributable risk? What is this population attributable risk? Beta, it is given by the formula incidence in the total population. Incidence in the total population minus incidence in the non-exposed divided by incidence in the total population. What is this population attributable risk? See, let us say that this pen is a disease. Just for example, understand my hypothesis over here. Let us assume that this pen is a disease. So let us say that this is diabetes or this is coronary artery disease or this is cancer. Why would a person get a lung cancer? Maximum portion is because of the smoking part, but there is also this white part which could be because of some other risk factors. So one is that most important is the smoking which plays a role, right? So let us say that smoking plays a role, maybe you can see it's around 60%. So if this whole thing is cancer, 60% was because of the smoking component and remaining 40% was because of other components, could be because of predisposition, genetic predisposition or anything. Let us say that this was heart attack or this is myocardial infarction. Why would a person get heart attack? Probably the major role play was hypertension. But still other risk factors could be there, like stress was there, smoking was there, some other lipid problem was there, hypercholesterolemia, things like these, bad lifestyles. So there are other factors and there are main factors. So how much, listen carefully now, that is what the MCQs are. How much a factor plays a role in causing the disease. How much a factor plays a role in causing the disease, that is known as the attributable risk. So what is attributable risk? It is the percentage contributed by a risk factor in causing the disease. Okay. So let's write it down. What is attributable risk? What is attributable risk? It is the percentage contributed by a risk factor in causing the disease. In causing the disease is called as attributable risk. Okay. Now let us say that the smoking attribution was, maybe our hypertension attribution was 60% or smoking attribution was 60%. Let us say you are the DC of the city or of the town or of the state or whatever. So let us say that I am a technocrat. I come to you that, sir, please give me 20 lakh rupees. I will make smoking free city, your city, as the smoke free city, no more smoking in your area. You already know that smoking was 60% attribution for causing COPD or bronchial asthmas or any problem. So let us say that I say that we'll make the city as smoke free. So the smoking will come down to zero. Will the COPD prevalence will also come down? If I decrease hypertension to zero, the cardiac diseases or the ischemic heart disease will definitely come down. Coronary artery disease will come down. So will it come down? Yes. If the smoking was contributing 60% and if I make smoking as zero, will the disease come down by 60%? Answer is no, it will not come down by 60%. Will it come down? Yes. How much will it come down is given by this funda called as the population attributable risk. What is this population attributable risk? Please note it down. Population attributable risk, it is the percentage or the delta decline in the outcome variable. What do you mean by the outcome variable, beta? What is outcome variable? It is the disease, right? I hope you understand. Outcome variable means the dependent or the independent variable. It means the dependent variable. It is the percentage change or the delta decline in the dependent variable with a unit change in the independent or the risk factor variable. So how much of a disease will come down by a change in the risk factor is given by what? It is given by the population attributable risk. So if you understand this, can you think and tell me, for national health programs, we should take into account what? For national health programs, we should take into account the relative risk, the odds risk or the odds ratio, the attributable risk or the population attributable risk. What is most important? I think you all understand that we are talking about the population attributable risk, that how much the disease will come down with a change in the risk factor. That is what is the population attributable risk. It is given by a cohort study design. Another point of interest over here is how do you interpret the relative risk and the odds ratio. You remember relative risk is found in cohort studies because that corresponds to the incidence, and odds ratio is found in the case control study. So now the question may be asked, how do you interpret it? Please note that if the odds ratio is equal to 1, what does it mean? You remember what was the formula for odds ratio? Odds ratio is the logical cells by the non-logical cells. If the logic and non-logic is same, only in that situation you're going to get the odds ratio as 1. I hope you understand. So that means what about the association? Is it a positive association, like a negative, or a no association? Please note it is also called as a no association. Why? Because the logical cell is equal to the non-logical cell. The odds ratio is 1, right? What if the odds ratio comes out to be more than 1? That means the logic is more than the non-logic. That means whatever factor you were assessing, that is a risk factor or a protective factor, the logic is more. So what do you think? Please note this type of association is called as a positive association, and whatever factor we were assessing, that factor is a risk factor. That factor is known as a risk factor if the odds ratio comes out to be more than 1. However, if the odds ratio comes out to be less than 1, what does it mean? If the odds ratio comes out to be less than 1, that means logic is less than the non-logic. Non-logic is more. That means what? That means it is a negative association. That means what? That means whatever factor we were assessing, that factor is a protective. It is what? It is a protective factor. So please note that odds ratio equal to 1, no association, more than 1 is positive association, and less than 1 is a negative association. On the same principle, let us talk about the relative risk. What is relative risk? It is the risk ratio. If the risk ratio is equal to 1, what does it mean? If the risk ratio is equal to 1, what does it mean? That means, you remember what is relative risk? Relative risk is incidence in the exposed divided by incidence in the non-exposed. If it is equal to 1, what does it mean? Common sense, if it is 1, that means risk in exposed is equal to the risk in non-exposed. That means what? No association. It means the same. If the relative risk is more than 1, what does it mean? Common sense, same answer. It is risk in exposed is more, so it is a positive association. The factor you are assessing is a risk factor. And if the relative risk is less than 1, that means it is a negative association, or the factor that we were assessing is a protective factor. So that is what the MCQs might be. They will say that if the odds ratio is 1.2, what does it mean to you? It means a positive association or a risk factor. If the odds ratio is 0.8, what does it mean to us? It means a protective factor. Relative risk 0.8, protective factor. Relative risk 1.2 is a positive association. So that's all that you need to remember for your exam. And this table that you have made over here and the understanding is one of the most important things, because please remember, in a cross-section study, you start with total population. In a case control study, you start with disease, non-disease. In a cohort study, you're going to start with the risk factor, exposed and non-exposed. With that, thank you so much for watching this module. In the next one, we are going to talk yet again more about in-depth about more analytical study designs.